Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Russ Harrison with IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. A lot of stuff going on in Washington. This is kind of a hardcore legislative season, April into May and June, before Congress turns most of its attention to the budget. So in a normal year, this is busy. First year of a presidency, it's even busier. So lots of stuff going on. So we will get right into it. Start off by recognizing the holiday that today is. On this date in 1789, George Washington was sworn in as our first president. And so arguably, today marks the start of the modern American Republic. There's some other dates you can pick to note, when the Congress was sworn in and when the first elections were held or whatever. But somewhere right around today, and possibly today, the United States adopted its republic, the first real modern republic in the world, and that makes the United States the oldest government by a sizable margin on the planet, except possibly for Iceland, depending on how you define these things. But we're not going to worry about that. So congratulations to George, and recognize the great start this country had in our first executive leader. Start off with the big news from this last week. The Endless Frontier Act was finally introduced. We had been expecting it for a couple weeks. It was delayed for various reasons. These things happen, but it has been introduced. It's very similar to last year. The big change seems to be that it does not actually change the name of the National Science Foundation, which is probably wise. That change got a lot of people worked up. And it doesn't matter what we call the agency. So it removes that controversy while still allowing the important parts of the bill to move forward. More on that in a moment. The primary sponsors and primary co-sponsors are exactly the same as last year. In the Senate, we have Senator Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader from New York, and Senator Young, Republican Senator from Indiana. In the House, Representative Khanna, representing California, Silicon Valley specifically, and Gallagher from Wisconsin. So we have a really nice set of leaders on this issue. We have, well, the most powerful, arguably most powerful person, second most powerful. Nancy Pelosi's probably about more powerful. But one of the more powerful legislators in Washington with Senator Schumer as our champion, with three excellent lieutenants backing him up. From both parties, both chambers, nice geographic dispersion. There's about 18 other co-sponsors on the bill at the moment from all across the country, almost precisely divided between Republicans and Democrats, which is really hard to do in kind of normal times. But it does demonstrate that this is a very, very popular bill among both parties, which is a good start. Unfortunately, there's a downside. We'll get to that in a second. The basic structure of the bill is the same as before, $100 billion in new research funding. Actually, the new version bumps that up sort of to $112 billion, which is interesting. Senator Schumer's first bid for this bill was $100 billion in new research dollars. The White House came back and said, well, we think we could do $50 billion for research. Schumer countered by saying, let's do 112. Which tells you a little bit about Senator Schumer. But it's roughly $100 billion, a little more than $100 billion in research, divided into 10 specific research areas, which are up there on your screen. These are the same as last year. All of them focused, well, almost all of them focused on technology and IEEE and IEEE members, which is very exciting. These are also the most promising pieces of the economy, arguably, for economic growth, for job growth, for national security, and all the other good things that we care about in the economy. So the drafters of the bill have done a good job at targeting the bill at the most promising parts of the innovation economy. But that's not the cool thing about the bill. And rereading the bill, if the bill is 230-something pages long, the bulk of that text is spent on the not spending portions, the not research portions of the bill, which leads you to conclude that reality about the Endless Frontier Act is that it is not a research bill. It's an economic development bill focused on tech transfer and research. In other words, the research is important, and $100 billion is a lot of money, and that's going to have a big impact on the country, and it's a very good thing that Congress definitely should pass. But the other pieces of this bill that haven't gotten as much attention, I think, are at least as consequential. For example, the Endless Frontier Act allocates $9.425 billion for between 10 and 15 new regional technology hubs, $535 million to the Regional Technology Strategy Grant Program, $2.41 billion to promote the Manufacturing USA program. Now, what these three programs, and there's some other smaller things in there as well, these programs have in common is that they are tech transfer programs. They're designed to help companies take research out of academia, out of the national labs, and turn them into products, turn them into companies, turn them into actual economic growth and jobs. That is something that we are not very good at. The United States isn't. Nobody is really. It's very hard to do. But the gulf between academic research and national lab research and the private sector is kind of vast. And it's proven to be very difficult to bridge that gap. The Endless Frontier Act is focusing a lot of resources and a lot of legislative time narrowing the research gap between basic research and applied research in the private sector. And that's pretty exciting. But they're not just creating the infrastructure to encourage tech transfer. What Congress is proposing is, for example, the Regional Technology Hub program. Like I said, that'll create between 10 and 15 regional technology hubs, but not just anywhere. What has to happen is someone needs to create a consortia that is a group of universities, private companies, nonprofits, other interest groups, local governments in a specific area, in a specific region, to come together to develop a plan for creating innovation-based economic growth in their, wherever it is that they are. The Regional Technology Hub program then gives them the opportunity to get funding to create a regional technology hub, which is then free to do more or less whatever the local area needs to do tech transfer and create economic growth, particularly through the creation and expansion of existing technology-based companies. Regional technology hubs can give grants to do research. This would be more applied research at specific companies. It can be used to develop regional economic plans to attract investments to small businesses in your region. It can be used for worker training programs at all levels, from not college all the way up through postdoc, not K through 12 STEM ed. There's some language in Endless Frontier for K through 12 kind of public education. But after that, community colleges, vocational technology training, which is very important. And it's important for two reasons. One is politically it's important to make it clear that all Americans can benefit from this funding. But also it's a good idea. We have to invest in America's brightest, most creative, most innovative people. You don't create entire new technologies without a genius being involved. We need Edisons, basically. Or, to put it more modern in terms, we need Musks. Because the fact of the matter is, without Elon Musk, there is no SpaceX, or Tesla for that matter. But the thing is, it is also true, without an army of skilled professionals behind Elon Musk, there is also not a SpaceX. He needs a ton of trained, competent professionals to just do stuff, to build his spacecraft, to build his company, to do all the things that his company needs to be able to do well to succeed. Some of those folks need PhDs in material physics or astro whatever. Some of them don't need college degrees at all. They just need specialized training before they can get a good job, building a spaceship, which is kind of cool. The Endless Frontier Act recognizes the value of skilled professionals at all levels of educational attainment and allows regional development consortia to spend technology hub money to make sure that their region has that. The Endless Frontier Act goes one step further. Excuse me. So the Endless Frontier Act goes one step further to say the regional technology hubs can be founded anywhere, or created anywhere in the country where these consortia are developed, so long as that area is not currently kind of a hub of innovation and technological creation. In other words, Silicon Valley is not getting one of these. Boston isn't getting one of these. Vermont might, but Boston isn't. And the goal here is to pull the benefits of technological innovation out of the 5 or 6 clusters that have been dominating innovation in the United States for the last 100 years. Well, that's exaggeration, the last 50 years at least. Silicon Valley, Boston, Austin, North Carolina, Seattle, a couple other places. To pull the technological innovation out of those places and get it going in the rest of the country. There have been a number of studies in the last few years that have shown that the big tech dominant cities in our country have done most of the innovating and have received most of the benefits from innovation, which is reasonable. But the fact of the matter is there are some very innovative people in other parts of the world, other parts of the country rather, who don't have the same opportunities that people in Silicon Valley or Austin have. And with a little bit of effort, Congress thinks that we can create new little clusters of technological innovation to take advantage of the talent, take advantage of the skills of different parts of the country to increase the amount of innovation America can do. So what we have here is a bill that's really focused on not just innovating, but taking the benefits of innovation and spreading them widely across the geographic United States and deeply into the American population. Funds in there to target underrepresented people in the STEM fields, and particularly in engineering, to help minority-serving institutions, historically Black or Hispanic universities, to help them develop the talent that goes to those schools. So there's lots of progress in this bill to make sure that the benefits of innovation and the opportunities of innovation are spread widely across society, which is a very exciting thing. So for all these reasons, IEEE-USA does not consider the Endless Frontier Act to be a research bill. I mean, it is. There's lots of research in there. But it's mostly a technology transfer infrastructure bill and an economic development bill. And seen in that light, these non-research provisions, the research stuff is important, very critical that we get that passed as well, but the non-research provisions are at least equally important and are very exciting in what they can do for our country. So what are the politics of all this? Well, in the last week, we started to really see how this is going to play out. At the moment, there are 230 filed amendments to the Endless Frontier Act, which is a very large number, which shows us that lots of people in Washington and across the country think the Endless Frontier Act is going to pass. And so everybody is trying to attach everything to it, because if you can get your thing attached to it, it will probably become law, much like the NDAA last year, except that the NDAA actually did have to pass while Endless Frontier does not, which is a bit of a concern. There will be a Senate markup of the Endless Frontier Act on May 10th, which is not that far from now. So Senate leadership will be deciding which of the 230 amendments will be included in the Endless Frontier Act over the next couple days, early next week. And so what will happen is some of those amendments, the leadership will just say, yeah, we'll include that. The text will just get added to the Endless Frontier Act. Whereas other amendments they'll pass on, and senators can try to bring them up through normal order as an amendment and have a separate vote on it. But that's a lot to go through in a week. So they're going to go fast. And all indications are that Senator Schumer wants to move this bill as fast as he can. And so now he's going through the amendments to figure out what he has to agree to get 60 votes to overcome a filibuster to get his bill through the Senate. And if it goes through the Senate, then he's going to push hard to move it in the House very quickly. That's where the interesting complications come from. There is a conflict in the House between the Endless Frontier Act and the NSF, National Science Foundation Reauthorization Bill. The reauthorization bill includes a large amount of additional money for research. It doesn't target it at any particular type of research. It just increases the NSF's budget. A bunch of other language in there pre-K education language, which is kind of weird, but not our issue. A lot of studies, which are fine, but not necessarily all that helpful. Here's the problem. The Endless Frontier Act was introduced by Congressman Ro Khanna in the House. Ro Khanna does not sit on the House Commerce and Science Committee, which irritated the House Commerce and Science Committee leadership, who felt that this bill should have come through them. So the House Science Committee has taken the position that the Endless Frontier Act has to go through them, and they're not going to look at it until after they pass the NSF reauthorization bill, although maybe they can add EFA to the NSF reauthorization bill, which creates additional complications. There are some principled issues at stake here. There are legislators who are legitimately concerned about the targeting that is being done in the Endless Frontier Act. Generally speaking, Congress raises the research budget for agencies, but doesn't tell the agency how to spend it. The Endless Frontier Act, it's 10 broad categories, but is much more focused. And it doesn't say all the NSF budget priorities will go up. It just says certain priorities will go up. And there are legislators who have problems with that. But mostly this is a jurisdictional dispute. The House Science Committee is irritated that they were not going to take the lead on this bill, and they are asserting that they're going to take the lead on this bill. We'll see how this shapes out. IEEE-USA is speaking to all the relevant legislators up on the Hill at the moment, trying to find a way through. Part of that is, by the way, pointing out to legislators that the Endless Frontier Act is not actually a research bill. There's research in it, but it is mostly an economic development bill, and thus the fact that Ro Khanna had to go to the Commerce Committee was reasonable. We are still optimistic that the Endless Frontier Act will pass. Whether it will pass in June or next December remains to be seen, but we're optimistic that this is something that's going to happen this year. Probably not June, but maybe in November of this year. So the other big news of this week, political news, was that the 2020 census results, at least the first bunch of them, were announced. As of the end of the census, whatever day that was, there were 331,449,281 people in the United States, which is up 7.4% from 10 years ago. 7.4% is actually low for us. The United States usually grows faster than that. And almost all of the decline came in natural population growth. Americans are having far fewer children. Immigration, there was a decline during the COVID shutdown last year that's starting to now open back up again. But immigration has been pretty strong for the last 10 years overall, but natural, internal population growth has shrunk. But anyway, 7.4% still pretty quick for a big country like ours, particularly an industrial country like ours, thanks to immigration. The most populous state remains California with about 39.5 million people. California did grow in the last 10 years, but not by a lot. It was actually one of the slower growing states. The least populous state, I think, I didn't look it up, but I think Wyoming was also the smallest state 10 years ago, with just over 500,000 people is Wyoming, which I understand is precisely how they like it. The fastest growing state in terms of population is Texas, up to 29 million people. The fastest growing state percentage-wise is Utah, starting obviously from a much lower base. The slowest growing part of the United States is actually Puerto Rico, which saw a decline of over 10% over the last decade. Most of that has to do with Hurricane Maria and the other hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico over the last several years. Each time a major hurricane hits, a large number of Puerto Ricans move to some other state. Puerto Ricans are, of course, Americans, so they can go wherever they want. But we've seen the impact of those storms has been substantial, with a over 10% decline in the population in the last 10 years. So what does this look like for reapportionment? How are the congressional districts and electors for the Electoral College going to be distributed? Well, this map is the map I showed you a couple months ago. It is based on the preliminary estimates from the census that came out last year. And you can see the basic story. Population shifted from the Northeast to the South and West, which has been the story of the United States for the last 200 years, more or less. with the exception of California, which for the first time in history was scheduled to lose a congressional seat. Texas was scheduled to get 3 new seats, Florida 2. New York was on the edge of losing 2 congressional seats, with the other seat coming possibly from Alabama. This is not what happened. This is what the map looks like. It's actually much smaller in the sense that there's much less change than people were expecting. There have been a number of studies done over the last 6 or 7 years showing that Americans are not moving as much as we used to. Housing costs, the difficulty millennials are having getting going, younger Americans getting into the workforce, have caused Americans to stay put more than we used to. And it showed up in the census. This is one of the least active reapportionments in American history. It actually is very similar to the reapportionment we saw in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when nobody moved, other than people affected by the Dust Bowl. But you can see the same basic trends are there. You still clearly see a shift from the Northeast to the South and, most importantly, to the West. California will lose a congressional seat for the first time in its history. New York won't. It'll only lose 1 seat instead of 2. Minnesota, Rhode Island will lose none. They were both, the estimates suggested that they would both lose 1 seat. And instead, Arizona also won't gain a seat. Oregon, however, will. And Oregon was not scheduled to get a new seat. Texas will not gain 3 seats. It will gain 2 seats. Florida will not gain 2 seats. It will only gain 1 seat. So again, less across the board than we expected. Interesting little aside, for those of you wondering if those census surveys you filled out, presumably at one point in the last couple of years, if they matter, if New York had 98 additional residents, it wouldn't have lost any congressional seats. It was that close. 98 more New Yorkers, and Minnesota would have lost 1 seat instead of New York, which is interesting. Now, the effect of all this is minimal. The experts that are looking at what this does to congressional elections estimate that Republicans should benefit from between 2 and 4 congressional seats based just on the simple redistribution of seats. There are some states like New York, like Illinois, like California that are dominated by Democrats, where Democrats will likely lose a seat. Most of the states gaining seats have redistricting controlled by Republicans, and so they should pick up some of those. But then there are states like Ohio and especially West Virginia. West Virginia loses a seat, and everybody there is a Republican, and so Republicans lose a seat. And Ohio loses a seat as well, and there are Democrats in Ohio, but not very many of them. It's going to be very difficult for the Republicans in Ohio to draw a map that passes legal muster that eliminates one of the very few Democratic seats left in Ohio. And so the overall effect will be between 2 and 4 seats, which is not very much, except when you realize the Democrats currently have a 4-seat majority in the House. So if the Republicans were to flip 2 seats, they would have the majority in the House. Now, that's because there are some vacancies in the House at the moment, many of which will be filled by Democrats, but it's still single digits. So a 4-seat flip could be the difference between a Republican or Democratic House next year. So what happens next? The census will release the district level data. Right now, we only have state level data. The district level data will be released in August or September, which is important because that's the data that's needed to draw congressional boundaries and other political districts. That's late. The COVID situation slowed things down, so we're behind schedule. States are going to really have to rush to get those lines in place before next spring so that the new lines can be used for the November 2020 elections. The way this process starts, the primary process begins in March, with primary selection processes picking up in April, May, and particularly in June and July, and some cases September, but some states will have their primary contests early. And of course, you need the lines in place well before the primary so people know where they're running. It's not at all clear all the states will be able to do that. It is unlikely that all the states will be able to create a map, get it approved by the legislators, signed by the governor, and through the courts. The courts have been much more active in overturning state maps in the last few years, last couple decades, since we don't do this that often. I was going to follow this slide up with a nice slide kind of breaking down how the various states do their redistricting processes, but it turns out there are about 50 different systems for the 50 states. If you're interested in reading more about how your state or any other state does the redistricting process, it's a fascinating look at different approaches to the same problem. The National Council of State Legislators has a very good website up that breaks all this down, and there's the link if you are curious. Totally different subject. The Department of Labor released its final independent contractor rule. You may remember last September and October, IEEE-USA commented on this proposed rule, which clarifies how to determine if an individual is an employee or a consultant. The approach that the Department of Labor took back in September that IEEE-USA supported and was then enshrined in the final version of this rule looked at what's called an economic reality test. It has a couple factors that kind of give courts guidance in how to determine if someone is an employee or an independent contractor, but doesn't have kind of hard and fast rules. The theory being that the economy is so complicated and the various types of employment are so varied that hard and fast rules probably wouldn't work. So instead, it creates some guidelines, some things the court should look at, some priorities and what the criteria is, but then kind of leaves it up to the courts. IEEE-USA supported this position, more or less. We had some critiques to it and some things that we wanted adjusted in it. But this economic reality test is consciously the exact competitor to the ABC test that we saw in AB5 out in California and the PRO Act here in Washington. ABC test has 3 criteria, A, B, and C, and you have to meet all 3 of them to be an independent contractor. It's a very cut and dry, doesn't mean there's a lot of gray area in there, but it's a much more rule-based system and a much more criteria-based system with much less discretion, which creates problems if you don't have a long list of exemptions. The final Department of Labor rule agreed with most of our suggestions, which we like and appreciate, but it's not actually the final rule. There is a process agencies have to go through to make a new regulation. And in this case, once the comment period closes, the next step has to be the issuing of a final rule, which is what happened here. But basically, the instant the new rule was issued, the Department of Labor put it on hold and has now put out a new rulemaking withdrawing this whole idea. So it would withdraw the economic reality test and go back to the old rule. Wouldn't enshrine the ABC test, although I suspect that's coming. What's happening here is this is becoming a partisan issue. The Democrats are coalescing around the ABC test. Republicans are coalescing around the economic reality test. IEEE-USA doesn't have a position on which one is preferable. Both can work as long as the correct language is put in there. ABC test, we need some exemptions that we've talked about before for technology consultants, which we also need specific legislation to the economic reality test, although that's a little easier. But it would be nice to get some clarity on this one way or another. So the work that IEEE-USA did commenting and working on the DOE and the Department of Labor independent contract rule proved to be not terribly useful, and it will now go away. We'll have to keep an eye out for Department of Labor law on the ABC test, which I suspect will come out at some point. A couple interesting hearings, one about to happen, one that just did happen. We have human-centered AI addressing social justice, which is interesting because it's the House Financial Services Committee that's holding a hearing on artificial intelligence. Excuse me. Looking in particular at Bitcoin and kind of automated financial tools using artificial intelligence to buy and sell stock and what that does to the marketplace and the economy. But it's interesting that financial services is getting into the artificial intelligence game. Excuse me, there's a lot of pollen out here in DC today. But it shows you just how popular AI is on Capitol Hill, and how serious legislators are taking the technology. Another bill on driving innovation, the future of automotive mobility, safety, and technology was a good hearing in the Senate earlier this week. A recording of that hearing is available on the committee website if you're interested in seeing it. If you want to watch the Financial Services Committee hearing live, there's a link there, financialservices.house.gov/live. You can watch it Friday the 7th, which is next Friday at noon Eastern. Lastly, just wanted to let you know that IEEE has joined IRVA. I think that's how you say it, the Engineering Research Visioning Alliance within the National Science Foundation. This is a partnership between a number of prominent engineers and other researchers looking down the road to see what innovations, what technologies are coming at us, so NSF can adjust its research priorities to accommodate them. It's something they do regularly. IEEE is pleased to be part of it. IEEE-USA is pleased to be working with the rest of the IEEE on this project. The website's there if you're interested. I was on the website earlier this afternoon, and for some reason, our logo hasn't appeared on the website yet. It's coming. It's just a clerical thing. But we are an affiliate member, and we're looking forward to working with the NSF on this project. My next update will be May 21st, which some of you will note is not 2 weeks from now. It's actually 3 weeks from now. Because Jonathan, my producer, who helps make these things work, is going to be taking a vacation on the 14th. We have bumped my update to the 21st, which also moves us nicely around Memorial Day weekend. We will then have another update 3 weeks after that to put us back on schedule. But our next update will be 1 o'clock Eastern on Friday, May 21st. And I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. If you have any questions you'd like me to respond to, please put them in the little chat box on your screen while I get out of my share screen mode so I can actually see that box and know what I'm supposed to reply to. Hold on 1 second here. There we go. Boop. Oh, we've had a busy chat today, which is good. All right. Vice President Torres asks, what efforts are in place to inform the section's regions on the status of the EFA bill? An article has been written for Insight, which should be appearing shortly. Next week, we're going to be blasting emails out to people asking them to respond and say nice things to their senators and congressmen about the Endless Frontier Act. Any of you listening should feel free to do that now. Our messaging on the Endless Frontier Act is pretty simple. We need to make investments both in research and in the infrastructure needed to move that research into the private sector to create jobs and economic growth. The Endless Frontier Act does that. It needs to be a priority, and it needs to pass in 2021, whatever year this is. It needs to pass this year. But Mark, we will be leaning on all of our volunteers to spread the word on this. This is a big deal. The Endless Frontier Act is a big kind of life-changing bill. These things don't come around very much. And more to the point, if Senator Schumer, Senator Young, Congressman Khanna, and Congressman Gallagher are going out on a limb to try to support our professions and our sector of the economy, we have to back them up with political support. So we will be doing our best to do that. Any response on last week's Cyber Response and Recovery Act put forward by Senators Peters and Portman? It's a good bill. There are a number of good bills dealing with cyber defense, cyber response, cyber protections. IEEE-USA is kind of waiting back a little bit to see which of these bills becomes the bill. What happens is legislators introduce a bunch of legislation. Some of it is serious attempts to legislate. Some of it is a small bill to tweak something a little bit. And some of it's a messaging bill just to give a member of Congress the ability to say on a campaign stump next year, I introduced legislation to fix cybersecurity. This is probably a serious bill. Both Senator Peters and Senator Portman are important senators and serious senators. They are also senators we partner with regularly. So I suspect that bill is going to be important. There are some bigger bills out there, so this might be subsumed into one of them. But we're waiting to kind of see. The senators will decide how they want to move it, and we'll see what they decide before we get behind it. There may be some other bill that becomes the vehicle for the ideas in that one. Vice President Robinson, there is a significant amount of synergy between semiconductor and provisions of the Semiconductor Manufacturing and provisions of the Endless Frontier Act, and there is. The CHIPS Act is a different thing, and it is a good question. Should we be trying to incorporate the CHIPS Act into the Endless Frontiers Act? First of all, the Senate may do that with or without us, which is fine with me. I do have some concerns that the Senate may add too much to the Endless Frontier Act, and it just gets bogged down with other things, and that causes it not to pass. Now, I don't think the CHIPS Act is controversial enough to cause problems, but I would much rather have an Endless Frontier Act pass without the CHIPS Act than have an Endless Frontier Act with the CHIPS Act that doesn't manage to pass. So we're going to see what the Senate decides to do with all their amendments. We are in favor of the CHIPS Act. There are other vehicles the CHIPS Act could be part of. The president has explicitly made the CHIPS Act part of his infrastructure plan, so it could move as part one of the infrastructure bills. Again, we're kind of waiting to see how senators decide to handle it before getting behind it, because I don't particularly care what vehicle it uses to pass as long as it does in fact pass. Oh, yes. Robert Burke asks a very difficult question. Is there going to be a concerted effort in the future to reduce overall college costs? Yes. Beyond that, I don't know. The price of the price of college is enormous, which I know because my son will be going to college next year. He's got his senior year in high school left, but he'll be going in soon, and I see what the sticker price is on those things. A number of legislators are noting how expensive college is with concern. The real action on this issue, however, is in the states, looking at state universities. A number of states have become very skeptical about funding the state universities without reforms. That reforms are targeting a number of different things, but one of them is just the price of college. It is $80,000 a year for college. That seems a bit out of whack, particularly since most of the new college spending that's being funded by increased tuition is not going for academics. It's going for administration. It's going for fancy dorms, food plans, athletic centers, which are all nice and lovely. But it's a lot of money to get a college degree these days, and we probably need to do better. Now, Mr. Burke, IEEE-USA is not involved in that particular fight. We could be if the members wanted us to be, but in general, IEEE-USA gets involved in a political issue when two criteria are met. First of all, it needs to be an issue that uniquely affects engineers, which this doesn't. It needs to be an issue where engineers are affected differently than the broader American public. We do sign on to legislation sometimes that affects everybody, but generally we try to keep ourselves to things that are unique to the engineering community. Secondly, we get involved in political fights when we have something unique to say. We generally don't get involved in big fights, even if they directly affect engineers, if all we're going to do is say everything they said is right. We are a relatively small government affairs office. If the big guys are fighting over something like, healthcare reform or immigration reform, generally speaking, we stay out of it and let them do the work. And then we pick the little pieces of the big debate that are unique to our members, where we have something unique to say, and we get involved. The problem with college costs is it's not really unique to IEEE. And so we probably wouldn't get involved, but I'm sure Congress is going to rotate to it eventually. Vice President Godfrey asks a very technical question. Any thoughts on Senator Portman's bill to increase U.S. influence in international standard setting? Given that IEEE-USA worked with Senator Portman on that bill, we think it's great. So the idea is this. As most of you know, there are different types of standards development processes. One of them is technically called an international standards development process, which typically involves foreign governments negotiating safety standards and other things. The United States has not been especially active in that area over the last 7, 8, 10 years. Other countries have been active and are becoming more active. And there is a concern that other countries will use these standard setting meetings to use international standards to give their companies preferential access and a competitive advantage on the free market. Senator Portman, a couple of his staffers, and a few other staffers in other offices are very concerned about this. It's a pretty arcane issue for Congress, but a couple guys up there, a couple folks up there have really started to focus on this. We've been providing them with technical assistance, working directly with the IEEE Standards Association to help them understand what an international standard is, the difference between that process and our process, because we don't want to get wrapped into this whole fight, and generally helping them understand the whole ecosystem, because it is kind of a weird little piece of the economy. So Senator Portman's bill is a helpful bill, pushing the administration to invest time, people, and resources into international standards development processes. It's a pretty, like I said, a pretty arcane bill. So we'll see if we can get it to get traction. But Senator Portman's committed, and that's always a good start. Oh yeah, James, good question. The bill has, the Endless Frontier Act has not actually, the text of the bill has not appeared in congress.gov yet. It should be up any day. It usually takes them, a week or so to get the text in there. And so it came out on Monday or Tuesday, so it should be up early next week. If you do a Google search for the Endless Frontier Act and click on Senator Schumer's website, there's a press release in Senator Schumer's and Senator Young, and I assume Khanna's, although I haven't actually checked. There's a link on their website, in their press release, to the text of the bill. If you can't find it, send me an email and I'll email it to you, but it's a big file. So if you can find it online, that's probably a lot easier. Economists say Taiwan Semiconductor is leading the technology over 10 years and 85% market share of advanced chip manufacturing. What do I think? I think they're probably right because they're smarter than me. It raises an interesting issue here, which is the CHIPS Act and other bills like it designed to revitalize chip manufacturing and technology manufacturing in the United States is aimed at other countries, particularly China. However, we don't want to catch other countries, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, in the crossfire. In other words, the economies of Taiwan and South Korea are heavily dependent on computer technology manufacturing, chip manufacturing in particular. And while the United States would like to do more new manufacturing, we certainly don't want to hurt our overseas allies at the same time. There's a provision in the CHIPS Act that explicitly informs the administration that when implementing the CHIPS Act, he or she should be worried about the impact on our overseas allies. Now, the bill doesn't say Taiwan and South Korea, but that's who it's trying to target. And so IEEE is a global organization. We have to always be aware of the global implications of the policies we endorse. The CHIPS Act is a good bill that we support, but we also like the fact that it does take the impact of these of the policies in the bill, and the impact of those policies on other countries into account. Yeah, Vice President Robinson notes that there's a plan to build a new semiconductor foundry in Arizona. I don't remember when that announcement was made, but I think the announcement actually came out a year or so ago, which was more or less when the CHIPS Act was introduced. So I suspect it's not exactly connected to the two, but I am sure that TSMC is looking at the CHIPS Act with excitement, because if it passes, they can get the government to pay part of the cost of building their fab, which I understand is rather large. So I'm sure they're excited about it. But yeah, Arizona, Texas, a few other states are positioned to do quite well if the CHIPS Act passes. Endless Frontier Act will have a broader impact. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, which is fine. Again, if you have any questions about anything that came up here today, anything that I didn't talk about today, please feel to get in contact with me. My direct phone number is 202-530-8326, and my email address is r.t.harrison@IEEE.org. Our next update will be in 3 weeks on May 21st. Hope you all have a great spring between here and there, and that we can talk again in a couple weeks. Thank you for joining us today.
My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE-USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.